One quiet decision, made in the middle of a race nobody was even watching closely, has just triggered an FIA investigation into Max Verstappen, and it could completely flip the narrative around Lewis Hamilton's season. Because while everyone was focused on Norris dominating every single lap, something far more calculated was happening behind the scenes. Verstappen didn't fight. He didn't push. He didn't even try to gain one more position. And that's exactly why the FIA is now asking questions. Data, patterns, behavior that doesn't match what we should be seeing under the new rules. Here's the part that makes this serious. Other drivers were being penalized for crossing the limits, pushing too hard, losing control. Verstappen wasn't even close. Not once. And in Formula One, when one driver plays a completely different game, it usually means one thing. They know something others don't. If this investigation confirms it, Hamilton's biggest weakness this weekend might suddenly become his biggest advantage. Because this wasn't just a quiet sprint. This may have been the moment everything started to unravel. At first, nothing about the Miami sprint felt controversial. 19 laps, clean start, no chaos at the front. Lando Norris controlled the race from the very first corner to the final flag, completely untouched, building a gap, managing his pace like everything was already decided. And that's exactly how most people saw it. A simple story. McLaren is back. Mercedes is struggling. Ferrari is hanging on, but that version of the story is missing something critical. Because while Norris was leading, and while the cameras stayed locked on the front, the real tension was building further down the order. Max Verstappen crossed the line in fifth. No overtakes, no pressure, no visible mistakes. Just a flat, controlled race. And that might sound normal until you remember who we're talking about. This is a driver who attacks gaps that don't exist, who turns small opportunities into aggressive moves, who rarely accepts a position without a fight. So why did he accept fifth without even trying to change it? That question doesn't go away. In fact, it gets worse when you compare him to everyone else around him. Because other drivers were pushing so hard under the new regulations, they started making mistakes. Antonelli crossed the track limits too many times and lost a podium. Leclerc did the same and picked up a penalty. The reason is simple. With reduced energy deployment, drivers now have to carry more speed through corners. Imagine running on a tight path, but suddenly your shoes give you less grip. To keep the same speed, you start stepping wider, closer to the edge, sometimes over it. That's exactly what was happening in Miami. Everyone was dancing on the limit, except one driver. Verstappen never crossed it. Not because he was slower, but because he never needed to push that far. And that's where things stop making sense. Because in a race where everyone is struggling to stay within the lines, the one driver who stays perfectly inside them without losing position becomes the biggest question of all. And this is where the story quietly shifts. Because the sprint wasn't just about who was fastest. It was about who was hiding something. And Verstappen's race felt less like competition and more like a calculation. Now the tension starts to rise because what looked like a quiet race is starting to look like something much more deliberate. The key moment wasn't an overtake. It wasn't even visible on the broadcast. It was a simple question over the radio. Verstappen asked if he could attack Leclerc, and the answer came back instantly. No, save the tires. This race doesn't matter. That sentence sounds harmless, almost routine. But here's where it gets interesting. In a sprint race, every position gives you points. Every point matters in a championship fight. And yet, Red Bull chose not to take them. They didn't just avoid risk. They avoided intent. Now think about that for a second. If a team knows they can fight, but chooses not to, it usually means they are protecting something more valuable than points. And in Formula One, there's only one thing more valuable than points on a Saturday. Information. Because this sprint came at a very specific moment. Right after regulation changes that forced every team to rethink how they use energy through a lap. Less electrical boost, more reliance on mechanical grip, more pressure on tires, more instability in corners. Most teams reacted the same way. Push harder, brake later, carry more speed. And as we saw, that led directly to penalties. Drivers stepping just a little too far outside the limits. Tiny margins, big consequences. But Red Bull didn't follow that pattern. They did the opposite. They held back. And that creates a strange contradiction. Because Verstappen later admitted the gap between teams had been cut almost in half. So if the competition is closer than ever, why would you choose not to fight? Unless fighting would reveal something you're not ready to show. And this is where the suspicion begins to build inside the paddock. Because Formula One teams don't just race for results. They race for data. Every lap is a test. Every corner is a signal. Every throttle input tells a story. And if you believe that, then Verstappen's race starts to look very different. Not passive, controlled, measured, like someone following a script rather than reacting in the moment. And here's the part that makes engineers pay attention. When a car behaves differently under pressure, it leaves a signature. In the data, in the way it accelerates, in how it exits corners, in how it manages energy without crossing limits. That's not something you can hide completely. You can only hide it long enough. And according to what's now being discussed, that signature may be exactly what triggered the FIA to take a closer look. Because if one car is operating just outside the expected behavior window, even slightly, it raises a very uncomfortable question. Is it driving better? Or is it operating differently? And that question is where everything begins to change. And this is exactly where the story explodes, because once the FIA starts looking at patterns instead of moments, everything changes. We're no longer talking about a single move. We're talking about behavior across the entire race. Throttle traces, energy release, corner exits, the kind of details fans never see, but teams obsess over. Because in Formula One, performance isn't just about how fast you go. It's about how you get there. Now here's the critical shift. When engineers compared the data from Miami, something didn't fully line up with expectations under the new regulations. Remember, with reduced electrical boost, every car should struggle in similar ways. Less acceleration out of corners, more sliding, more dependence on tire grip. That's why we saw drivers exceed track limits. They were compensating, pushing beyond the edge just to stay competitive. But Verstappen's car didn't behave like that. Not consistently. It looked stable. Too stable for the conditions everyone else was dealing with. And that's not an accusation. That's a discrepancy. And in Formula One, discrepancies are where investigations begin. Now connect that to the bigger picture. Red Bull already knew they were not the fastest car in Miami. Verstappen himself admitted the gap had closed significantly. So logically, they should have been under pressure. They should have been pushing harder than anyone, taking risks, chasing positions. But instead, they did the opposite. They removed pressure. They avoided fights. They kept everything controlled. And that creates a very uncomfortable possibility. What if the goal wasn't to win the sprint, but to run a clean, invisible test under real race conditions? Because there is no better place to test something subtle than in a race where nobody expects you to dominate. Now bring in the FIA. When something doesn't match the model, they don't react immediately. They observe. They compare. They cross-reference data from different cars, different laps, different drivers. And if one car shows a pattern that cannot be easily explained, that's when a quiet investigation begins. No headlines, no accusations, just questions. And right now, those questions are pointing in one direction. Because if Verstappen's performance came from something within a gray area of the rules, something clever, something difficult to detect, then Miami wasn't just a race. It was the first time it became visible. And here's why this matters more than anything we've said so far. Because Formula One isn't decided by obvious advantages. It's decided by the things that look normal until they don't. And once the FIA starts looking at those details, teams don't just lose performance, they lose confidence. They start questioning everything. Setups, data, comparisons. And suddenly, drivers like Hamilton, who seemed completely out of pace, are no longer measuring themselves against a clear reference. They're measuring against uncertainty. And uncertainty is where championships start to shift. Because if the reference point is wrong, then the entire competitive order might be wrong with it. And that's the kind of realization. That doesn't just change a weekend. It changes how every team approaches the rest of the season. And now the consequences start to take shape. And this is where Lewis Hamilton quietly moves from the background to the center of everything. Because up to this point, his race looked like a disappointment. 7th place, more than 20 seconds behind the leader. No real fight at the front. Even he admitted it didn't make sense. He expected more pace. He didn't understand the drop. The car just wasn't there. On the surface, that sounds like a team struggling. But under this new light, it starts to look very different. Because if the FIA is now questioning how one specific car behaved under the same conditions, then every gap on that track becomes questionable. Not erased, but reinterpreted. And that's a powerful shift. Imagine running a race, giving everything, pushing your limits, and still finishing far behind. You walk away thinking you were slower, but later, you find out the reference you were chasing might not have been completely normal. That changes how you see everything. And for Hamilton, that changes the narrative completely. Because his biggest problem in Miami wasn't just performance, it was comparison. He wasn't just losing time. He was measuring himself against something that may now be under scrutiny. And if that reference point moves even slightly, his position changes with it. Now expand that idea across the grid. Mercedes struggled because the new rules forced them out of their comfort zone. Ferrari sat in between, fast but inconsistent. McLaren nailed the moment and dominated cleanly. And Red Bull didn't reveal their true level. That creates a split reality. What we saw versus what was actually happening. And when those two things don't match, the consequences don't show up immediately. They build. Because if the FIA decides to step in, even with a small clarification, it forces adjustments. Tiny changes. But in Formula One, tiny changes can cost tenths per lap. And tenths per lap decide everything. Suddenly, a car that looked stable becomes unpredictable. A setup that worked perfectly stops working. A driver who felt in control starts second-guessing every corner. And drivers like Hamilton, who already know how to adapt under pressure, become dangerous again. Not because they gained speed overnight, but because the playing field shifted. And here's the part that teams fear the most. Not penalties, not headlines, uncertainty. Because once a team realizes that another car might have been operating in a gray area, they stop trusting their own data. They start chasing something they don't fully understand. And that leads to mistakes. Strategic mistakes, setup mistakes, even driving mistakes. And that's how momentum flips in a championship. Not with one big moment, but with a chain reaction that starts quietly. Just like this one. So what looked like a simple sprint result might actually be the beginning of a much bigger shift. One that doesn't show up on the results sheet, but shows up in everything that comes after.